betrayal, ambition, and a single marriage that set Europe ablaze. Welcome to the story of Maria Theresa of Austria, where a royal union triggered a war that reshaped a continent. Maria Theresa of Austria stood at the heart of a brewing storm, her life woven into the fabric of a fragile empire. Born in 1717, she was no ordinary royal daughter. She was the heir to the sprawling Habsburg dominions, a patchwork of lands stretching from the snow-capped Alps of Austria to the rolling hills of Hungary, the castles of Bohemia and the sunlit ports of northern Italy. Her father, Emperor Charles VI, ruled this vast Holy Roman Empire, but his reign was haunted by a single glaring problem. He had no son. In a world where crowns passed to men and women were often relegated to the shadows of courtly life, Maria Theresa's destiny was extraordinary. Her marriage to Francis Stephen of Lorraine, a union sealed with hope and strategy, was meant to secure her throne and strengthen her family's grip on power. Instead, it became the spark that ignited a war, pulling Europe into a whirlwind of betrayal, ambition, and bloodshed. The Europe of Maria Theresa's time was a cauldron of rivalries, where kings and queens played a high-stakes game of power. The Habsburgs, with their centuries-old dynasty, were the linchpin of the Holy Roman Empire, a sprawling collection of semi-independent states bound by tradition and fragile loyalty. But their dominance was under threat. France, under the cunning Louis XV, watched the Habsburgs with a predatory gaze, eager to chip away at their influence. Britain, building its naval might, clashed with France over colonies and trade routes. Spain, still dreaming of its golden age, maneuvered for advantage in the Mediterranean. And then there was Prussia, a rising star led by the young and ruthless Frederick II, later called the Great, who hungered for territory and glory. This was a continent where peace was a fleeting guest, and every alliance was a calculated gamble. Charles VI knew his empire's survival hinged on Maria Theresa. Without a male heir, he faced a crisis of succession that could unravel everything his family had built. To secure her claim, he crafted the Pragmatic Sanction, a legal decree that declared Maria Theresa his rightful heir. He spent years cajoling and bribing Europe's rulers to accept it, from the courts of Madrid to the palaces of St. Petersburg. Promises of land, money, and favours flowed freely to win their support, but promises in the 18th century were as brittle as autumn leaves. Many rulers nodded in agreement while secretly plotting to exploit the Habsburgs' vulnerability. A woman on the throne? To many, it was unthinkable, a crack in the foundation of an empire they could pry open. Maria Theresa herself was no delicate flower. Raised in the opulent halls of Vienna's Hofburg Palace, she was educated in statecraft, languages, and the art of leadership. Her father saw her potential, grooming her for a role most thought impossible for a woman. She was sharp, resolute, and fiercely devoted to her family's legacy. But she was also young, barely 23 when her father's death thrust her into the spotlight. Her marriage to Francis Stephen of Lorraine in 1736 was a cornerstone of Charles's plan. Francis was charming, well-mannered, and deeply in love with Maria, but he wasn't a heavyweight in the game of European politics. His Duchy of Lorraine, a small but strategic territory nestled between France and the Habsburg lands, was the real prize. The marriage was meant to cement an alliance, tying Lorraine closer to the Habsburgs and bolstering their defences against France, which had long coveted the region. But this union, meant to fortify, instead exposed fault lines. Lorraine was a sore point for France, which saw the marriage as a Habsburg power grab. Louis XV and his advisors bristled at the idea of their rival tightening control over a region so close to French borders. The marriage also sent a signal to other powers. The Habsburgs were doubling down on their ambitions, but their empire was vulnerable. Charles's Pragmatic Sanction, despite his efforts, was no ironclad guarantee. Frederick of Prussia, with his disciplined army and sharp mind, saw Maria Theresa's youth and inexperience as an invitation. Why honor a decree when you could seize a province? Silesia, a wealthy Habsburg territory rich in coal and farmland, became his target. Other rulers, from Bavaria to Saxony, began whispering of their own claims to Habsburg lands. Sensing a chance to carve up the empire, the marriage itself was a grand affair, steeped in the splendor of Habsburg tradition. Maria Theresa, radiant in her gown, and Francis, dashing in his finery, exchanged vows in Vienna, their union celebrated with feasts and fireworks. But beneath the pomp, the ground was shifting. France, Prussia, and others began to maneuver, forming coalitions and sharpening their swords. The marriage didn't just unite two people, it united enemies against a common target. Maria's claim to the throne, her father's decrees, and her husband's ties to Lorraine created a perfect storm. What should have been a moment of triumph became a prelude to war, as Europe's powers prepared to test the young Archduchess and her empire. As Maria Theresa stepped into her role, she faced a world ready to pounce. Her marriage, far from securing peace, had stirred a hornet's nest. The stage was set for a conflict that would engulf nations, redraw borders, and define an era. The story of Maria Theresa and her marriage is not just about a woman or a wedding. It's about a continent on the brink, where a single vow could spark a fire that burned for years. Charles VI's final days were shadowed by fever and dread, his body wasting away in the grand halls of Vienna, as whispers of his mortality spread like wildfire across the courts of Europe. On October 20th, 1740, the emperor drew his last breath, leaving behind a daughter thrust into the maelstrom of rule and a continent poised to devour her inheritance. Maria Theresa, now Archduchess of Austria and Queen of Hungary, found herself crowned in a hurried ceremony, her hands trembling not from fear, but from the weight of a realm teetering on collapse. The pragmatic sanction, that fragile parchment her father had laboured over, crumbled almost instantly under the onslaught of ambitious challengers. Frederick II of Prussia, with his piercing blue eyes and unyielding ambition, wasted no time. Just months after Charles's death, Prussian troops marched into Silesia, claiming the rich province as rightfully theirs under ancient treaties, twisted to suit their needs. Frederick's invasion was swift and brutal. His modernized army, drilled to perfection with muskets flashing and cannons thundering, overrunning Habsburg garrisons before Maria Theresa could muster a defense. The young queen, pregnant with her second child and surrounded by scheming advisors, rallied what forces she could. Her generals, caught off guard, scrambled to respond, but Prussia's precision strikes shattered Habsburg lines at battles like Mollwitz, where fog and confusion turned victory into a Prussian triumph. Frederick justified his aggression with cold legalism, arguing that Maria's gender invalidated her father's decrees, and that Silesia had been pledged to Prussia in forgotten pacts from the War of the Spanish Succession. But beneath the rhetoric lay raw greed. Silesia's mines and factories promised wealth to fuel Prussia's rise from backwater kingdom to European powerhouse. Maria Theresa, fiery and unbowed, appealed to her Hungarian nobles in a legendary assembly at Pressburg. Dressed in mourning black, she held her infant son aloft, tears streaming as she vowed to defend their ancient rights. The magnates, moved by her plea and their own stakes in the Habsburg order, knelt and swore fealty with cries of "Vitam et sanguinem," life and blood for their queen. This loyalty bought her time, arming levies from the Hungarian plains who would prove fierce warriors in the years ahead. France, sensing blood in the water, threw its weight behind the anti-Habsburg cause. Louis XV, advised by Belle Isle and his bellicose ministers, saw a chance to dismantle the empire that had long checked French expansion. They backed Charles Albert of Bavaria, a distant Habsburg relative with a tenuous claim to the imperial throne, showering him with gold and troops. Bavaria's armies, bolstered by French support, invaded Austria proper, sacking villages and threatening Vienna itself. Saxony and other German states joined the fray, lured by promises of Habsburg territories. Even Sweden and Spain dipped toes into the conflict, forming the sprawling coalition known as the War of the Austrian Succession. Maria Theresa's diplomats raced across Europe, forging unlikely alliances. Britain, wary of French dominance, sent subsidies and naval aid, while Dutch merchants funneled loans to keep her coffers from emptying. Russian Empress Anna, though initially neutral, leaned toward intervention, her vast armies a looming threat that Frederick eyed nervously. The war's early years were a torrent of invasions and desperate counterstrikes. Prussian forces consolidated Silesia, their engineers fortifying key towns against Habsburg reconquests. Maria Theresa's husband, Francis, proved more consort than commander, leaving military decisions to generals like Khevenhüller, who harried invaders with guerrilla tactics in the Tyrol. A pivotal moment came at the Battle of Chotasitz in 1742, where Austrian resilience forced Frederick into a grudging peace. The Treaty of Breslau, ceding most of Silesia, but granting a temporary truce. Yet peace was illusory. The wider war raged on. French and Bavarian troops pushed deep into Bohemia, crowning Charles Albert as Holy Roman Emperor in Prague's cathedral, a mocking coronation that stripped Maria Theresa of her father's imperial mantle. Vienna endured sieges and plots, its walls bristling with cannons as spies ferreted out traitors in the ranks. Maria Theresa's personal resolve shone through the chaos. She bore children amid the din of war, 8 in quick succession, yet never faltered in council, poring over maps by candlelight and issuing edicts to reform her army. Her faith sustained her. Processions and masses filled the streets, invoking divine favor against the godless aggressors. The coalition fractured under its own weight. Frederick, ever the opportunist, switched sides briefly to check French ambitions, only to betray again when suits aligned. By 1745, exhaustion crept in. The Battle of Fontenoy saw French glory in the Low Countries. But at Fontenoy, British and Austrian allies held firm against overwhelming odds, their redcoats and whitecoats standing shoulder to shoulder in a rare moment of unity. Maria Theresa's envoys negotiated relentlessly, leveraging Britain's growing empire to pressure France. As battlefields cooled and treaties loomed, the war had already carved deep scars. Silesia remained Prussian, a permanent thorn in Maria Theresa's side, fueling her lifelong enmity toward Frederick. The conflict exposed the Habsburgs' military weaknesses, prompting reforms that would define her reign. But the marriage's shadow lingered. Francis's Lorraine ties had drawn France's ire, amplifying the invasion that followed Charles's death. Europe, redrawn by bayonets and diplomacy, entered a fragile peace at Aix-la-Chapelle in 1748, restoring some lands but affirming Prussian gains. Maria Theresa, wiser and harder, emerged not broken but forged in fire, her empire scarred yet intact. The wolves had tasted blood, but the queen had bared her teeth, setting the stage for deeper intrigues and a rematch that would eclipse the first. Maria Theresa stood undaunted, her empire battered but unbroken, as the dust of early battles settled into an uneasy truce by 1748. The Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle had paused the War of the Austrian Succession, but peace was a thin veil over Europe's simmering ambitions. The young queen, now a mother of 10, her auburn hair streaked with the strain of war, had learned harsh lessons in survival. Her marriage to Francis of Lorraine, once a hopeful alliance, had inflamed rivalries, pulling France and Prussia into a conflict that cost her Silesia and nearly her throne. Yet, in the quiet years that followed, Maria Theresa turned her gaze inward, determined to rebuild her realm and prepare for the inevitable next clash. She was no longer the naive Archduchess of 1740. War had sharpened her into a ruler of iron will, ready to reshape her destiny and her empires. Vienna buzzed with her reforms, a whirlwind of energy that transformed the Habsburg domains. Maria Theresa knew her army, outmaneuvered by Frederick's disciplined Prussians, needed an overhaul. She appointed Field Marshal Daun, a meticulous strategist, to retrain her troops, emphasizing speed and coordination. New barracks rose across Austria and Hungary, filled with recruits drilled in modern tactics, their muskets gleaming under stricter discipline. She streamlined the empire's patchwork administration, centralizing power in Vienna to cut through the tangle of local nobles' privileges. Tax reforms filled her treasury, squeezing wealth from merchants and aristocrats alike. While her chancellor, Kaunitz, a wiry diplomat with a mind like a steel trap, reorganized the court to root out corruption. These changes weren't just paperwork. They were the sinews of a stronger empire, built to withstand the wolves still circling. Her personal life, too, bore the weight of duty. Francis, her beloved husband, was a steady presence, his charm soothing tense counsels, though his military ventures faltered. Their marriage, rooted in genuine affection, produced a sprawling brood, 16 children in all, each a potential pawn in the game of dynastic alliances. Maria Theresa, ever the strategist, began eyeing matches for her offspring, particularly her eldest daughter, Marie Antoinette, whose future would tie Austria to France in ways none could foresee. Yet, even as she played the devoted mother, her nights were spent poring over dispatches, her quill scratching out orders to fortify borders and stockpile cannons. Her faith remained her anchor. She attended Mass daily, her prayers blending pleas for strength with gratitude for survival, as churches across Vienna echoed with hymns for their queen. Europe, meanwhile, was shifting beneath her feet. The Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle had left no one satisfied. Frederick of Prussia, flush with Silesia's wealth, strutted as Europe's new power, his army growing stronger by the day. France, though victorious in battles, chafed at Britain's naval dominance and sought new allies. Maria Theresa's chancellor, Kaunitz, saw an opportunity in this discontent. In a daring diplomatic pivot, he proposed an alliance with France, her old enemy, against Prussia. This diplomatic revolution of 1756 turned the European order upside down. Austria and France, long rivals, clasped hands, joined by Russia and Sweden, all united against Frederick's ambitions. Britain, fearing French expansion, sided with Prussia, creating a new fault line that split the continent. Maria Theresa's marriage, which had once drawn French ire, now indirectly fueled this realignment, as Lorraine's shadow lingered in French calculations. The spark for renewed war came swiftly. Frederick, ever paranoid and sensing encirclement, struck first in 1756, launching the 7 Years' War with a preemptive invasion of Saxony. His troops, hardened by years of drills, smashed through defences, aiming to cripple Austria's allies before they could unite. Maria Theresa responded with ferocity, her reformed army marching under Daun's command. At battles like Kolin, Austrian forces bloodied Prussia's nose, proving her military reforms were no mere paper promises. Hungarian hussars, their sabres flashing, harassed Prussian supply lines, while Austrian artillery pounded fortified towns. Yet Frederick, a master of manoeuvre, struck back at Leuthen, his troops outflanking a larger Austrian force in a snowy rout that left Maria Theresa's generals reeling. The war's toll was relentless. Villages burned from Bohemia to Brandenburg, and famine stalked the land as armies requisitioned harvests. Maria Theresa, safe in Vienna's Schönbrunn Palace, felt the weight of every loss. Letters from her generals carried grim tallies of dead soldiers and shattered towns, yet she pressed on, funneling gold to her allies and rallying her people with speeches that stirred hearts. Her alliance with France proved fickle. French generals, more focused on colonial wars with Britain, dragged their feet in Europe, frustrating her plans. Russia's armies, though fierce, were slowed by their own vast distances. Still, Maria Theresa's resolve held firm. She sent envoys to every court, from Madrid to Copenhagen, weaving a web of promises to keep her coalition intact. By 1763, exhaustion forced another peace. The Treaty of Hubertusburg restored the pre-war borders, but Silesia remained Prussian, a bitter pill for Maria Theresa. Her reforms, however, had saved her empire, proving her mettle as a ruler. The war, sparked in part by the ripples of her marriage, had reshaped her from a vulnerable queen into a formidable monarch. Her alliance with France, though strained, set the stage for future dynastic ties, while her enmity with Frederick burned brighter than ever. As she stood on the balcony of Schönbrunn, gazing over her war-torn but enduring empire, Maria Theresa knew the story was far from over. The seeds of her marriage's consequences were still sprouting, and Europe's next chapter loomed on the horizon. Maria Theresa, now a seasoned ruler, turned her gaze to securing her empire's future through her children, her marriage's legacy casting a long shadow over Europe. The 1763 Peace of Hubertusburg had left her empire intact, but Silesia lost, and her hatred for Frederick of Prussia burned quietly. She focused on dynastic alliances, marrying her children strategically to bind Europe's courts. Her daughter Marie Antoinette's betrothal to France's Dauphin Louis in 1770 was the boldest move, aiming to cement the Austrian-French alliance born in the diplomatic revolution. The lavish wedding, with its glittering Versailles backdrop, masked tensions. French nobles distrusted Austrian influence, and whispers of Marie's extravagance sowed seeds of unrest. Maria Theresa's other children wed into Bavaria, Parma and Naples, weaving a web of Habsburg influence, but each match stirred rivalries, as Prussia and Britain watched warily. At home she pressed reforms, modernizing schools and freeing serfs to strengthen her realm. Her energy unyielding despite Francis's death in 1765, a personal blow that left her in widow's black. Her son Joseph II, co-ruler, pushed radical ideas, clashing with her cautious pragmatism, yet their partnership fortified Austria. Frederick, meanwhile, schemed to limit Habsburg power, backing smaller states to counter her alliances. The 1778 War of the Bavarian Succession flared briefly when Maria Theresa blocked Prussia's grab for Bavarian lands, ending in a stalemate, but proving her diplomatic clout. Her marriage to Francis, though a spark for earlier wars, now fueled her dynasty's resilience, as her children's unions reshaped Europe's fault lines. By her death in 1780, Maria Theresa had transformed a vulnerable empire into a powerhouse. But the French Revolution loomed, threatening to unravel her daughter's fate and her legacy's delicate balance. Maria Theresa's final years were a tapestry of triumph, woven with threads of impending tragedy. Her marriage to Francis of Lorraine rippling through history to shape Europe's destiny. By the late 1770s, the Empress, now in her 60s, her once vibrant auburn hair greyed by decades of rule, had transformed the Habsburg Empire into a formidable power. Her reforms, modernized armies, centralized governance, and emancipated serfs had fortified her realm against the chaos her marriage had unwittingly unleashed. The 1736 union, meant to secure Lorraine and her throne, had instead sparked the War of the Austrian Succession, inviting Prussia's Frederick II to seize Silesia and France to challenge her legitimacy. Those early wars, fueled by her gender and Francis's contested duchy, had tested her mettle, forging a queen who outmaneuvered Europe's predators. Yet, as she neared her end, the consequences of her dynastic ambitions, rooted in that marriage, were poised to ignite new fires. Her 16 children, born of a love match rare for royalty, became her greatest diplomatic weapons. Marie Antoinette's 1770 marriage to Louis XVI of France was the crown jewel of her strategy, binding Austria to its former foe in a fragile alliance. But Versailles was a viper's nest. Marie's extravagance and Austrian roots fueled resentment among French nobles, planting seeds for the revolution that would erupt in 1789. Other children, wed to rulers in Bavaria, Naples, and Parma, extended Habsburg influence, but each union stoked tensions. Prussia's Frederick, ever watchful, countered with his own alliances, ensuring Austria's gains were never unchallenged. The brief War of the Bavarian Succession in 1778, where Maria Theresa thwarted Frederick's ambitions, showcased her diplomatic finesse, forcing a peace that preserved her empire's borders. Her son Joseph II, now co-emperor, pushed radical reforms, but his impatience clashed with her tempered wisdom, creating friction even as they strengthened Austria together. The shadow of her marriage stretched beyond politics. Francis's Lorraine heritage, which had drawn France's ire, indirectly shaped the French alliance through Marie Antoinette, whose fate would haunt Maria Theresa's legacy. The Empress's reforms, born from the wars her marriage triggered, modernized education and law, lifting peasants from feudal chains and fostering a bureaucracy that outlasted her. Her faith, unwavering through decades of crisis, guided her to endow churches and schools, leaving Vienna a cultural beacon. Yet her death in 1780, surrounded by her children in Schönbrunn's candlelit halls, came just as storm clouds gathered. The French Revolution, sparked in part by the tensions of Marie Antoinette's position, would guillotine her daughter and unravel the alliance Maria Theresa had so carefully built. Frederick's Prussia, emboldened by Silesia's wealth, set the stage for Germany's unification a century later, a direct legacy of the wars her ascension provoked. Maria Theresa's marriage, a spark that ignited a European inferno, was both her crucible and her catalyst. It exposed her empire's vulnerabilities, inviting invasions that tested her resolve, but it also birthed a dynasty that reshaped the continent. The War of the Austrian Succession and the 7 Years' War, triggered by her union's geopolitical fallout, redrew Europe's map, elevating Prussia and cementing Austria's resilience. Her children's marriages, especially Marie Antoinette's, extended her influence, but sowed the seeds of revolution. As her heart gave out on a cold November night, Maria Theresa left an empire stronger than she found it, a testament to her unyielding spirit. Her story, born from a single vow, reminds us how love and strategy can ignite wars, forge empires, and echo through centuries. If you've been swept away by this tale of power and passion, hit that subscribe button and comment below. Your support means the world to us.